It's not often I get to guest preach these days because we have been doing weekly worship for a while, and even though I planted a church with a co-pastor, that goes into part of that wanting to build the DNA of planting additional churches. Me and my buddy Brian, who's also a United Methodist pastor, wanted to build a DNA and plant a church together and learn a model together, innovate a model together, learn what works, learn what doesn't work, and then multiply that DNA. And there's actually going to be, hopefully in the next few weeks or months here, some exciting announcements around that. But you'll just have to like us on Facebook and ask Ryan and to stay up with that. So I don't get a chance to get out and guest speak much, or I don't take a lot of extra speaking gigs. But being here today and preparing to present in front of an audience that I don't know for the most part made me think about a time a couple years ago where it was just a few minutes before I was going to go into a guest speaking gig, and I was backstage it was a venue, I think it was the Performing Arts Center in Scottsdale, downtown Scottsdale there, and I was really nervous. I was wondering, why did I take this gig? Why did I do this? This is going to be a disaster. And I was pacing really nervously backstage. I'd never been so nervous in my life before speaking engagement. But I wasn't as nervous as the guy in the full-blown Ghostbusters costume who was just a few feet away, who was also pacing really nervously, and he kept doing like this kind of thing. And I'm like, that guy's going to puke. At least I'm not going to puke, so it's going to be good. But I was backstage. I was also waiting to go on, and before I went out, I knew that there was a guy presenting in front of me. I was part of a group of presenters, and the guy who was presenting at the moment while I was back there nervously pacing, he was dressed in a tuxedo costume, and there were pictures of his chickens and his chicken coops going on behind him. So now you're all probably really confused. What kind of church was this? Well, it wasn't a church. I was a speaker as part of Ignite Phoenix. I don't know if anyone's heard of Ignite, either in Phoenix or anywhere else around the country or around the world, really. It's a format called Pecha Kucha, which is a type of event, a type of conference that was created by a bunch of architects in Japan who were really bored one night in a bar and thought it'd be really cool for them to have to come up with 5-minute speeches around a particular topic, but they would also be limited to they would have 20 slides, and these slides would be going on for the audience, and they would only be set at 20 seconds each. So if you got behind or lost your notes or forgot what you were saying or whatnot, or trailed off, you would get behind your slides, and then at 5 minutes, your slides stop and the microphone goes off. So if you're not done with your talk, you look really silly. So these guys started this thing called Pecha Kucha back in Japan. I think it was about 10, 12 years ago, and it was just a kind of a fun thing they did after work, and on the weekends they did a few of these conferences, and then it just started to spread like wildfire all over the world. And so Phoenix has hosted its own version of this called Ignite for a few years now. And I found out about it because I was having a conversation one day in downtown Phoenix very early on when I was planning City Square. I was in a coffee shop with this gal who's a spoken word artist, and I just met her through my networking and was really interested in what she was doing and what her spoken word was about, and maybe we could collaborate on something down the road. And I was telling her about this vision of our church to come down and to plant a church in the central core and the downtown of the city among folks for whom church wasn't a natural assumption, or for folks who had left the church, among this demographic of folks who were now calling themselves spiritual but not religious. And so part of my early work in City Square was just going around meeting these folks who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, including this spoken word artist. And I mentioned that I had been meeting a lot of people, these spiritual but not religious folks, who weren't going to churches or any other kind of organized religious institution, but were actually acting in very deeply religious ways, whether they knew it or not. And I told her a couple of those stories, and she said, that would make a really interesting Ignite talk. And I'm like, what's that? And she told me about it. She had been a speaker before, so I went home, I Googled it, pulled it up on the internet, and the application was like a 2-sentence long kind of thing. So I said, hey, let's just throw something in here. We'll call it, why being spiritual may be better than being religious, and another sentence of stories from a Christian pastor planting a church in a highly non-religious area, something like that. I'm like, no way they're going to pick that. And about a couple weeks later, I got an email that said I had been selected, and I'm like, oh shoot, now I actually have to come up with something valuable to say. So here I was on stage or in backstage about to follow my fellow presenter who gave a compelling 5-minute talk about how raising chickens in his backyard had changed his life. Now, before this, I had also gotten a range of the other speakers, including folks who were going to speak about circus performing, about photography, some other stuff I can't remember, and then I just remember the last guy who closed, a couple guys after me, talked about, he was a UFO hunter, so that was really, really exciting. So I had preached a lot before this. I had spoken before crowds before this, and this was a crowd of 900 people, most of whom I didn't know, and most of whom weren't there to hear from a pastor that day. But I did the talk, and it went really well. And afterwards, I was reflecting on it, and I sort of realized, speaking of spiritual but not religious folks, I had just given like a modern day or a postmodern sermon. And I thought about it more. All those folks had given these little inspirational, little informational, postmodern sermons. And then I thought about TED Talks. How many of us here watch TED Talks? Everybody watches TED Talks, or about even those kind of stupid like videos that constantly pop up in our Facebook feed now about just people. I shouldn't say people doing good stuff is stupid, but the fact that all these videos pop up in our timeline all the time is kind of stupid. I love you, Mark Zuckerberg. I forget that this is online. He's watching. Or just those little videos that kind of give us inspiration or teach us a little moral message. There's really popular ones now where these guys who go around and they ask for food, like at a food court from people, and nobody wants to share their food. But then they have everyone has 3 buddies that they go out and give Subway sandwiches to homeless folks, and then they go out and they ask the homeless folks for food, and they share the food. I think we've all seen some version of that. Well, social media is filled with what's all these little videos of these little mini sermons, in a way, these little teachings that are very similar to our biblical teachings. Another thing I noticed, I learned from this experience about being spiritual but not religious, was when I finished giving my talk and I went off stage, there was the stage manager who was there waiting for me and to get my microphone, and I think she was expecting my microphone, but instead she got 220 pounds of Rob just collapsing on her. And I just couldn't hold myself up anymore. I was filled with so much adrenaline and this amazing out-of-body experience that I had never felt before. And I realized I was having this deeply profound, larger-than-life religious experience that I had never had before. And I've grown up in the church. I'd been a pastor for a long time, and I'm thinking oh, this is what folks are talking about when they have this crazy out-of-body spiritual experience. And I'd only ever had that kind of close to that one other time when I was at a U2 concert with 100,000 other fans, and we were all just belting out U2 songs. But it made me realize the reason people aren't necessarily in our churches anymore is because they can experience the best of religion outside of institutionalized church. So during my talk, I told you I shared these stories of people who had moved to Phoenix's urban core, to the downtown and to the central Phoenix area. People who were looking for something that they couldn't find outside of urban areas. People who were tired of the sameness of the tract homes and the gated communities and the chain restaurants and big box stores and all that stuff. They were coming downtown, they were coming to the urban core to look for that arts community, for the music scene, for just more interesting restaurants and coffee shops and bars, for deeper sense of community among this new growth of urbanism and urbanites. People are steadily starting to flow, especially 18 to 30-year-olds, that millennial generation, flowing back to our urban core, looking for a more interesting and a more compelling way of life. So I had met, and I'm still meeting these people 2 years into it, and I may have become one, I don't know. But I met all these folks who I kept hearing these stories, and folks who had never been to church or hadn't been to church since they were a little kid, and they were telling me everything that was wrong with religion, how judgmental it was, how their gay friends weren't welcome at church, how women weren't allowed to be in leadership, or how they had to be subservient to husbands, and about churches who had just done really hateful things in the name of God, and they wanted no part of a church. I seemed like a nice guy, but they didn't want any part of my church or anybody else's church for that matter. And then I'd kind of push a little deeper to find out more about who they are and what they were doing. And sometimes I would have to stop myself from laughing so they didn't punch me in the face. But I was laughing because they started to share stories that were pulled almost right out of the gospel, or stories of people who were living as deep disciples without even knowing it. So there's this one guy, Mike, and Mike wasn't religious at all, but his mom had died a few years earlier, and that profoundly changed his life. And he was sitting there one day kind of in his grief, and all of a sudden an idea came to him that he needed to refocus his life, and he needed to find out more about what life was really about. And he just got this idea of, I'm going to sell everything I own, I'm going to get in my car, and I'm going to drive around the United States, going city to city, finding people in need and helping those people in need. I'm going to do that for a year. Let me read Luke 18 through 25, and I don't think I gave that to you guys, but I'll do this to you one more time, but then you'll have the slides. So Luke 18, a certain ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, Who do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments: you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother. He replied, I have kept all these things since my youth. When Jesus heard this, he said to him, there is still one thing lacking. Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have your treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And then there was the events and these gatherings that I kept running into in addition to these folks like Mike. These community art festivals, other community music festivals, block parties, mixers, meetings, celebrations, art shows, concerts, neighborhood association meetings, all these things designed to build a community, to get people to come out and to meet their neighbors and to make the city a better place. And these weren't events overwhelmed with folks who drove in from miles away, but these were the same people at these events. These were people from the downtown community, from the neighborhoods, from the high-rises, and from the central core. I even noticed a culture among businesses during this time, that businesses weren't in competition with each other, but they were coming together to share what they knew and to support one another, to make each other successful. There's so many coffee shops in downtown and central Phoenix, and you would think they would all be at each other's throats trying to get each other's customers and stuff, but they actually just created a little association called Phoenix Coffee Culture, and they just want to promote good coffee and good gathering spaces throughout Phoenix, and they're not fighting over people, but they're working with one another to make each other better. And that sounds a lot like Acts chapter 2, verse 42 and 43. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. This is the disciples right after Jesus had ascended, and they're about to start the ministry of the church. To the breaking of the bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as had any need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. So could it be that so-called secular culture Is doing church better than church is? Indeed, it just may be that being spiritual may be better than being religious, at least institutionally. Because I've often found that these best parts of spirituality and religion are outside the church without any of the negative institutional baggage that the church carries with it. And so this is part of the background of the foundation that has shaped City Square Church over the last 2 years or so. And Ryan mentioned we're about to celebrate our first year of Sunday morning worship. But for a full year before that, we were just figuring out what the heck we were doing. And to back up even more, to talk about why we started this church, for 5 years, to like 2007, 2012, I was the United Methodist campus minister at Arizona State University. And being a campus minister, especially at a Christian school like Arizona State, is very, very difficult. It was a very rewarding, very fulfilling job, and if I wasn't doing this, I'd love to be right back there doing campus ministry. But it was a lot different than what my colleagues, like at Ole Miss or down in Georgia or Texas or whatnot, were doing. And they were all like, man, I just give you props for being able to do ministry there. But it's a great place, and it's not everybody partying like on every corner. I'm sure we have a lot of ASU grads or folks who are currently there. But I would have students who would come in, and particularly United Methodist students, who I'd gotten their name from a pastor or a parent who had called and said, oh, you're getting Bobby. Bobby was the president of our youth group, and Bobby's going to be a pastor, and Bobby reads the Bible 7 times a day, and Bobby's going to be your number 1 campus ministry leader. And I'd be, sweet, can't wait to meet Bobby. I'd finally track Bobby down for coffee or lunch or whatever and sit down and be like, so how do you want to get involved? And he's like, get involved. For the first time in my life, I can make a decision of what I want to do around my own faith and spirituality. And I want to sleep in on Sunday. I want to explore other things. I was really active in all this stuff or whatever, but now I finally have a chance to figure all this out on my own. And that happened at least a few times a year. And I think that's just a little preview of what's to come as our society gets more and more religious, unless we do some things to change course. So that's kind of the atmosphere, the environment that I dealt with at ASU, but it was great because we were able to create a progressive community there where people, when they were ready, could come in and help. We could help them explore that, rather than try to indoctrinate them or continue to push something on them. And out of that came the start of City Square Church, because folks would come and find a healthy, comfortable faith community that they wanted to be part of during college, and then we would try to find something for them after they graduated college. And these college students would go to a mainline denominational church where they would be comfortable with the theology, with the politics, and whatnot, and it was very familiar to them, but there was nobody their age there. So they didn't feel like it was a place for community. Or they would go to a more conservative church that had lots of folks their age, but it didn't match their values or who they thought they were as a person of faith. And so they just gave up, and they wouldn't go anywhere. So around the same time I was getting frustrated with this, I noticed in downtown Phoenix there was something new going on. ASU downtown had been there for a couple of years. I was meeting with a group of students down there doing some small group Bible study and having coffee with folks sometimes. And every time I went down there, I kind of noticed like some more buildings and some more life and some things happening. I'm like, this is interesting. God's doing something down here. I wonder if someone will ever come down here and maybe like plant a new United Methodist church or a new church presence here. And I asked myself that like 3 or 4 times over the next few months, and then finally I was like, okay, got right. So it was a really hard decision, but I called my buddy Brian, who's working down at church in Tucson, and pitched him this vision for this church in downtown Phoenix, and he's like, I'm not exactly sure what it is. And I'm like, I'm not exactly sure what it is, like, but it sounds really cool, so let's do it. And we pitched it to our bosses, and kind of to our surprise, a few months later, they said, you guys start July 1, 2012. So we got to downtown, and I'm skipping over a lot of stuff, otherwise we'll be here all day long. And my 3-year-old, who already hates me in the nursery, will not like that. So we got on the ground July 1, 2012, and we spent just the first few months getting to know people, just meeting people, networking, asking questions. If they might have been religious folks, we asked, what do you think God's already doing down here in this community? If they weren't religious, we'd say, what's good in the community? What are the challenges? What are the needs? And we didn't try to pitch our grand vision for downtown Phoenix or for Central Phoenix, because we knew God was already at work, that there were already some really cool things happening in the arts community with the ASU downtown, with the restaurant and food scene, and with all this other stuff happening in downtown. So we wanted to not be harmful to the good things that were already going on. So we were listening for and looking for the place where we could add value ourselves or join with others in adding value. We were listening for that still small voice of God to tell us maybe exactly what our place was supposed to be in the downtown community. So ultimately, we discovered that our call was a relevant one, was a legitimate one to come and plant this church, because we were a little worried for a while, like maybe we made a mistake, maybe we're not supposed to be here. But in the conversations we had with people, there did seem to be a space where people were missing exploring a spirituality, not just on their own, but also in community. And a lot of people who not just hadn't been part of church before, but had been part of the church and had been burned by it in the past. And they said, I would go back to church if there was a place that was an open, welcoming, and affirming place where I could share my doubts and my questions, and I could explore my faith at my own pace. So we did hear that story a lot. And we also heard folks who just were interested in having the conversation of spirituality and religion, and finding a place where they could have those conversations of faith and of politics in a safe space with their neighbors, where even though people could come together from different backgrounds, that they could share with one another and be in dialogue and build relationships with one another. And so that's where our first signature event came from, which was our theology pub, it's wildly popular. I don't know why. You get to come to the bar once a month, and you get to sit around with really cool folks from the downtown community and drink beer and talk about spirituality and God. It's pretty cool. The first one, we thought like 5 people would show up, and like 20 people showed up, and we've now take over like a good chunk of Angel's Trumpet Ale House downtown on the second Sunday of every month. But it's exactly what I talked about before. It's folks who are Methodists, who are Lutherans, who are non-denominational, who are Episcopalians, Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, spiritual but not religious, Democrats, libertarians, Republicans, just whatever. There's this amazing cross-section of people from the community who come down, and we have like little table discussion leaders and a discussion sheet that has some questions around the recent topics and religion and politics and spirituality going on in the news. And we just create that space, and we just create an environment, and we let folks know, like, hey, this isn't a place to prove yourself right. This is a place to be in dialogue and to get to know your neighbors. And it's one of the most amazing things I've ever been a part of. And that's just one part of our church. And in many other ways, we look just like a regular church, just like this church. We have a Sunday morning worship service. We have small groups. We do outreach activities and stuff like that. And we've sort of developed this identity as we've developed our identity. We've made this commitment to not to replace the good work that folks are doing, but to help them in that work. Really early on, folks, especially within our denomination, who had heard about these 2 kind of young guys going downtown to do this new church, thought we were going to be a street ministry or a homeless ministry or a youth group ministry with all those college kids. And so they would grab me at a meeting or something and be like, hey, how's it going with the homeless folks? And I'm like, well, I've met a few, but I don't know what you're talking about. And part of that was in our kind of fact-finding time, in our discernment time early on down there, we discovered that downtown didn't need another homeless ministry. It didn't necessarily need another homeless nonprofit. We could always use good nonprofits and other services and stuff around homelessness and poverty. But we knew that we weren't going to be the guys to do that. We weren't going to be the guys who can make the impact. But we ran into a lot of directors and volunteers and employees and city and government folks who could make that impact. And so we began to ask them, not how can we replace the work you're doing, but how can we encourage you in the work we're doing? How can we support the work we're doing? How can we help you make the connections you need? How can we start to change mindsets and attitudes around homelessness and poverty through the work we do with our church? How can we be advocates for the work we do? And that's something that's been built in our DNA, is not seeking to replace parts of the community, but to become part of the fabric of the community, to help hold it together, to bond it together, to make it stronger, to make that network stronger, so we can all work together in doing this work. So in many ways, this has led us to be a church that is that spiritual, is that home for the spiritual but not religious. And we're made up of a lot of people who a couple years ago thought that they would never want to meet a pastor again or step inside a church again. And that comes with a lot of responsibility on our part, is that we have to care for those folks and we have to make sure not to hurt them or burn them again. So sort of openness and transparency is a big part of what we do at City Square. So we're always trying to avoid the bait and switch. So our church is kind of a slow burn church. It may build a relationship with someone for over a year before they first come and come into our doors and sit with us on a Sunday morning. And that's not even that's never my goal with folks, is and it's kind of antithetical to the institutional goals. My goal is never to just say, hey, I need to figure out the way I can trick you into coming into my church. It's about sharing what's exciting about the work we're doing and who we are. And if someone's not interested in what we're doing, I hope that we can partner with them and build a coalition with them to help make Phoenix better, to join forces on what we're doing. So even though it might mean less butts in our seats for us, we think in long term it means more community impact and more community transformation. So we're not trying to be a place necessarily just for one group or another group, but we're trying to be a place where people can come together in community and in this sort of beautiful messiness, and where we can figure out what it means to be community together. So our mission statement is to connect people to God and to each other for the transformations of our lives, our communities, and our worlds. Well, there's I guess there's a multiverse kind of theory out there. And anyway, and our world. To connect people to God, to each other for the transformation of our lives, our communities, and our world. And what we've discovered in our work downtown is that this work that God is calling us to was to strengthen these relationships between neighbors. And that's become more and more clear as we've entered our third year of ministry. And this to us came out of that great command that Jesus had to love God and to love our neighbor. And we find that first, the earliest version of that is in the Gospel of Mark. And there should be slides for that. In Mark 12:28 through 34. One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength.' The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is the one, and besides him there is no other, and to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask him any question. Now, Luke's gospel also has a version of this, but Luke kind of expands and goes into a little more detail on it. And he combines the teaching not into love God and then love neighbor, but into the greatest commandment is to love God and love neighbor. And then he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. But in case you forgot, it's that parable where there's a man who's been robbed, left to die on the side of the road, and I think it's the priest comes by first, and the priest is too busy and he can't help the man. And then there's one of the political elites goes by the man as well. He's too busy, he can't help him. But then the Samaritan man, and if we remember, the Samaritans during that time were despised by the people of Israel and vice versa. These were two groups of nations that did not like each other, that thought they were unholy, unclean, and they were sort of the scum of the earth. But so this man, Jesus says, who is the hated enemy, comes by and helps the man who had been beaten up in the road. And Jesus says, that guy acted like the good neighbor. And so Jesus there defines who our neighbor is. Our neighbor isn't just folks who live next door to us, or isn't just our friends, or isn't just other Christians, but our neighbor is everyone, including those of other religions, ethnic groups, and so on. And so when we want to know who our neighbor is, and we ask Jesus, Jesus says every human being is our neighbor. And so this is something we take very seriously. And this key piece of scripture that our mission statement comes from: love God, connect people to God, love neighbor, connect people to each other, especially neighbors from all types of different backgrounds that don't know one another and may not even trust one another. And if we can do both those things, connect people to God and to each other, we believe that we can not just transform people's lives in the communities, but we can transform the entire world. So we're living into a space that first and foremost calls us to be in relationship with God. And this isn't just part of the mission of City Square, who we are as City Square, but this is who we believe we are called to be and what we're called to do as Christians. And when we don't stop at just the relationship with God, because God that then turns around and calls us to be in immediate relationship with our neighbors. And that's not work that we should take lightly. But we are called as individuals and as churches to know our communities and to be an active part of them. And this seems especially important in a world where we have so many deep cultural and socioeconomical and ethnic and political divisions. You only have to look at the news these days and see what's going on in Iraq and Syria and the Ukraine, in Ferguson, Missouri, in our own communities, and see the deep divisiveness and the deep failure to understand each other and our neighbors, and our failure to be in relationship and in conversation to try to work through those differences and build more loving, transformative communities. So the easiest takeaway I think I could give you today is to encourage you to get to know your neighbors. So many of us don't even know our next door neighbors. So many of us just we come home, or our neighbors come home, and we park in the garage and go inside and hang out with our families, and then get up and go to work the next day and do it all over again. And in Arizona, there was a survey taken a couple years ago from one of the local community foundations that said that only 9% of Arizonans actually trust their neighbors. That's a really scary figure if you think about it. So our job as Christians is to try to break down those barriers, break down those walls with our neighbors, so we can build better communities and transform the world more deeply with God's help together. So the first step you can do today, because changing the world all in one swoop, we're not going to go out tomorrow and make the world like the kingdom of God that God calls us to help make. But what we can do is we can walk next door if we don't know our neighbors, and we can start to get to know them. We can have meals with them. We can be concerned about their lives. We can build relationships with them. Because once we're able to even step out of our comfort zones, to just know those folks who are right beside us and behind us and across from us, that's when God really starts transforming our hearts and our minds. And that's when we're able to start seeing people not just as the guy who doesn't pull his weeds often enough, but as a human being, as someone created in the image of God, as someone we're called to love, whether we know them or not. Because when we get to know people on a personal level, those religious and political associations don't become irrelevant, but they no longer become what defines us. And we don't see someone as a Republican or as a Muslim. We see them as our neighbor. And we may disagree, but we're no longer to deny that that person is a human being. And in a world that's increasingly questioning the need for church and organized religion, taking this simple yet radical step of getting to know our neighbors may be exactly what we need to do to transform the church into more of what it's supposed to be, and what it should have been, and what it was in the beginning. So don't email Pastor Ryan after church today and say, we need to start a theology pub. You can email him and say that speaker was terrible. That's fine, because I'll probably never be back here. Or say, hey, we need to move downtown to build a relevant church, because you're fine just where you are. Instead, go home and get to work on getting to know your neighbors. Stand in your driveway, take a look to your right, take a look to your left, take a look across the street, and then begin to take those steps to go over and meet one of those neighbors. From there, God will do the rest.